may eventually turn up, but in the meantime, we'll go ahead and get started. This is the review for the final exam. So what we're going to do tonight is to sort of rapidly survey everything we've covered, introductory matters, First and Second Kings and First and Second Chronicles, and everything associated with that. So going back to the very beginning, talking about Kings and Chronicles, Samuel, Kings and Chronicles, even though we usually categorize these books as history books, Hebrew history. In fact, most catalogs for most schools that teach the Bible categorize these books as the books of Hebrew history. Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. These are historical books, but they're also prophetic literature. And prophetic literature, in its niche in the scriptures, presents a more complete image, a more comprehensive picture of the history of the ancient world, and particularly the history of the Hebrews, than simple historical records do. There are secular historical records that correspond to this time, ancient writings and so forth, mostly not of Hebrew source, but of Assyrian and Babylonian and Medo-Persian periods, Greek and Roman from the later periods. But the prophetic historical literature gives us a more comprehensive view because it presents God's activity in addition to the simple historical facts. And the secular historical literature of the period gives us a lot of times the facts. For example, when Sennacherib came to Jerusalem and beat on the gates, so to speak, sent his servants to try to threaten and intimidate Hezekiah and his servants, we know that God told Hezekiah through Isaiah, don't worry about this, I'll take care of this, I'll fight for you. What did God do? The scripture tells us that an angel of the Lord basically annihilated Sennacherib's army, 185,000 soldiers in one night's time. As we pointed out several weeks ago, that sort of sheds light on Jesus' statement to Peter in the garden, put up your sword, don't you know that I could call more than 12 legions of angels? And if one angel could handle Sennacherib's army, what could 12 legions of them do? There wouldn't be any problem. But in secular history, we find reference to the fact that Sennacherib's army there in the region of Palestine, as we would call it, was badly defeated, that they were injured. Secular history puts it down to an illness, to a disease, but it doesn't explain how that many thousands and thousands and thousands died overnight. So we do have a secular corroboration of the incident, but we don't have the inspired explanation of its cause. So prophetic literature actually gives us a more comprehensive view. It gives us a better understanding as well of the social and the cultural and the economic circumstances of the ancient world. It helps us understand why they did some of the things they did, not merely from an economic or political point of view, but from a cultural and a religious or social point of view as well. I'm about to get my words mixed up here. It helps us appreciate the laws and the rituals that the ancient Hebrews tried to maintain. Now, one of the things that you may recall that we've talked about a little bit in passing is that some of the laws that God laid for the Israelites to observe, the Jubilee, for example, the 50-year return of property, the Sabbath year where they were supposed to let the land lie fallow for a year, and so forth. There's no biblical record that they ever actually did this. We have the instruction to do it. We have the law given in Exodus. We have references to it. When Judah goes into captivity at the end of 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, one of the observations made is that they will be in exile until the land has fulfilled its Sabbaths. 70 Sabbaths, which would correspond to 490 years worth of unobserved Sabbath years. 490 years worth every 7 years. So over 500 years that they've been in the land, seemingly, they had not kept that Sabbath year and let the land lie fallow. So it helps us better understand some of their laws and the rituals that were supposed to be associated with. It gives us some of the most specific, some of the greatest moral and ethical teaching that we find anywhere in the world of literature. Introduces some of the most fundamental and most important doctrinal ideas found anywhere in the writings of humanity, including inspired writings from God. We find here some of the finest literature, acknowledged even by those who don't believe in all human knowledge and human experience. Some of the loftiest concepts and the most beautiful sentiments, deepest emotions that the world has ever known. Now, what purpose does all this serve? It gives us a historical record. And we talked about the difference between Kings and Chronicles, how the book of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, basically is a running record, more or less in real time, of the events of about 400 years worth of kings in Israel and then in the divided kingdom. Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, on the other hand, appears to have been written post-exile, probably by Ezra. That's the traditional Jewish perspective, that Ezra wrote it. And it is a retrospective, a history lesson, if you will, for the post-exile generations to understand how they came to be in the circumstance that they're in. And so prophetic literature serves to appeal to God's people from a religious, a moral standpoint, to come back to God, to get into the kind of spiritual condition that they're supposed to be in, to get right with God, in other words, to lead them to higher moral and spiritual ground, so to speak. It also serves to encourage them, promises them better days to come. And if you think about it from their point of view, when are the best days to come for them? They should be anticipating the coming of the Messiah, the coming of the kingdom in this world. Now, the problem is that they think of themselves as the kingdom. We're the be all and end all. We're the embodiment of everything it is to be God's people. And they miss the spiritual component entirely. Which explains why, when we get to the 1st century and Jesus comes, so many of the leadership, so many of the scribes, the Pharisees, the chief priests, the teachers, the people that should have been most eagerly embracing him, reject him entirely because he wasn't what they were looking for. Now, the prophets themselves, throughout their period, and remember there are two categories of prophets. You have the literary or the writing prophets that we talked about for the last couple of weeks, and you have the non-literary or non-writing prophets like Elijah and Elisha and so forth. The prophets served as religious and moral teachers. Some of them were priests, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. Some of them were not. You think about Amos, for example. Amos was no priest. And then you have Daniel, who is of the royal household as well. But they were nevertheless teachers of morality. And the majority of their teaching consisted in two basic appeals, two basic points. Number one, straighten up, fly right, get right with God, you wicked people. Which that's kind of a humorous thumbnail way to put it, but that's the gist of what was what was going on. They needed to be corrected. So a whole lot of their work was corrective. But the other main point in most of their prophetic work is look forward, because God has more for you to do. God has more in store for you. God has greater blessings than these for you. And so they needed to be focused on their own future. Now, many of these men served as advisors to rulers. It's interesting to find that some of them were advisors to the kings. You have Jeremiah in the reigns of Josiah and all of those down to Zedekiah. You have Isaiah in the throne room with Hezekiah. Elijah interacting with Ahab. And others then whose focus was not so much on the rulers as on the people. Ezekiel and Daniel. They promoted the teaching of Israel. They were the reformers, if you will, the restorers, really, of that ancient age. They weren't so much trying to reform as they were trying to restore, bring God's people back. And that's been a common theme of God's men and a common purpose of God's servants almost from the beginning, which makes sense if you think about it, because what is the purpose of God's plan of redemption throughout all the ages?
Bring us back to God. Yeah.
To bring people back, to restore a right relationship with God, not to reform or make a similar relationship, but to bring us back, to reconcile us, which means bring us back to the original relationship, to the right relationship. Now, keep in mind, prophecy is not mostly predicting. Prophecy is mostly presenting or proclaiming, what we would call preaching. The majority of what the prophets that we read about in Kings and Chronicles have to say is not new revelation and not information about future events. There's some of that. And those points that are brought out in Kings and Chronicles are vitally important about the future. Josiah, for instance, 330 to 340 years before he was born, he was not only foretold, but foretold by name. And then Coniah or Jeconiah told that he would not prosper. His descendants would not prosper sitting on the throne of David in Jerusalem, which bears on the coming of the Messiah. But prophecy is not limited to, and it in fact doesn't primarily concern future events. It's focused primarily on expressing the will of God, reminding people of what God had already revealed. Now, it's not always limited only to the prophet's own time. We think about Isaiah, for example, and Isaiah in his own time speaks of the ending of the northern kingdom of Israel. He talks to Hezekiah about the future of the southern kingdom, Judah, but he also prophesies about neighboring nations and 800 years in the future about the coming of the Messiah and the character of the Messiah. Wonderful Counselor, Prince of Peace, mighty God, but also the suffering servant by whose stripes we would be healed. And so prophecy does not pertain only to the time of the prophet necessarily. Here's one of the things that the skeptic struggles with, because the skeptic wants everything to relate only to the time of the individual speaking or writing. They want to take away any supernatural, any God-given element. And that's not the case here. Now, as we look at First and Second Kings, the book of Kings, as it appears in the Hebrew Bible, the record of the Kings, First and Second Samuel, as we know them, the writing of Samuel gives us the origin of the monarchy, the origin of the rulership in Israel. It shows how we go from judges, Samuel is the last of the judges, to a kingdom with Saul because of the demand, the insistence of stiff-necked people, to the establishment of the Davidic kingdom, the Davidic lineage, when Saul proves to be unworthy of ruling God's people. And Samuel brings us up to the time of David's kingdom. So you pick up then in First Kings, and we have come to the end of David's life. The book of Kings, single book in the Hebrew Bible, 2 books in ours, takes up the history from David's last days down to the collapse of the kingdom in Babylonian exile, roughly speaking, a little over 400 years later. From about 1000 AD down to just after 600, specifically 586. I said AD, BC. From 1000 BC down to 586 BC. It covers a period of a little over 400 years. The record here, particularly Kings, because it chronicles both the northern and the southern kingdoms and the differences between the two and the shortcomings of each one. These books demonstrate that God blesses those who obey him and does not bless or punishes those who disobey him. And these books focus on both kingdoms, northern and southern. 10 tribes in the north, a tribe and a little bit of a tribe and scattering of other tribes in the south. Judah plus Benjamin, which is small and almost doesn't count in a sense numerically as a tribe, plus many of the Levites and those faithful, many of those faithful, not all of them, who had fled the idolatry of the northern kingdom in the days of Rehoboam and Jeroboam. So, First Kings, we have the transition from David to Solomon to Rehoboam and Jeroboam. We have in Solomon's day the construction of the temple, the enlargement of the city, the enlargement of the nation. David had expanded the boundaries of the nation. Solomon expands the wealth, the power, and the influence of the nation. Who wrote the record of the kings? Other than to be able to say the Holy Spirit, we can't really pin it down. These are anonymous books. Given that this is appears to be sort of a real-time running record, there may be more than one inspired writer involved. Traditionally, there is some similarity between the writings of Jeremiah and the writings of the kings. And certainly Jeremiah was a contemporary at the end of the period, but he wasn't present for the beginning of it. So if he wrote all of Kings, then much of it had to be written by inspired recollection of history. And if others were involved in it, then it would have been a running record inspired by the Holy Spirit. Now, Jeremiah was released from Babylonian captivity in about 585 after the fall of Jerusalem. He was then taken captive by his own people into Egypt, and we don't have a record of his subsequent life and death there. Notice, though, that 2 Kings, you come to the end of 2 Kings, chapter 25, there is no record of the Jews being permitted to return home by Cyrus, which takes place in 536. There's no record of the fall of the Babylonian Empire at this point. Which tells us then that the record of Kings seems to have been completed during or at the beginning of the period of exile, before that restoration took place. There are references to secular records in the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. You look at 1 Kings chapter 11 and verse 41, you have mention of the words, the book of the words of Solomon there. And Solomon, of course, we know was a prolific writer and songwriter, thousands of proverbs and songs. You have reference in 1 Kings chapter 14 at verse 29, and then again in chapter 15 at verses 7 and 23 to the books of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah. And this would not be the book that we know, or the books that we know as 1st and 2nd Chronicles, but rather this would be a reference to the what we might call the official history of the nation. And likewise in 1 Kings chapter 14 verse 19, and then again at the end of chapter 15 and verse 31, you have reference to the Chronicles of the kings of Israel, which would be basically the annals of Israel, the official history of the nation, rather than anything inspired. Now, we look at the division of the kingdom. We have 3 kings over 12 tribes, Saul, David, and Solomon. Over a 120-year period, they go from being a loosely knit affiliation or confederation of 12 tribes, all interrelated and connected to one another, to being an actual nation. And that is under the leadership of Saul, and then David, and then Solomon. At the end of Solomon's reign, we see that Solomon's influence has not been altogether good any more than Saul's or David's was. David's was probably the most consistently good influence. And even David had his weak moments and bad days, so to speak. Solomon, however, leaves behind a fool for a son, which is ironic given the wisdom that he had received from God. And that foolish son, Rehoboam, on the basis of his ego, acts in a way that causes the nation to divide. 10 tribes go to the north under the leadership of Jeroboam, who had been a servant and apparently a very capable servant of Solomon, leaving Rehoboam with Judah and Benjamin in the south. Now, that division is the beginning of formal idolatry, shall we say, among the children of Israel. There had been moments in their past, frequent moments, starting at Mount Sinai, when they had indulged in idolatry. At Mount Sinai, what had they done? Gather up all the gold and bring it to Aaron, and what? They brought it to me, they demanded it just came out of the fire, Moses. Yeah, right. But they had been worshiping a golden calf, which would have been familiar to them, comfortable to them after 430 years in Egypt. That would have been common. And the implication of Joshua's challenge in Joshua 24, 14 and 15 seems to be that many of their ancestors had participated in Egypt while in slavery in the worship of the Egyptian gods. Choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell, or the gods that your fathers worshiped beyond the river, which would be a reference to in slavery in Egypt. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So their root of idolatry goes back a long, long way. Throughout the period of the Judges, what do we see? Intermittent periods of idolatry accompanied by oppression by their idol-worshiping neighbors because of their faithlessness. Then God would raise up a judge to deliver them, and they'd be faithful for a few years. And then they would indulge in idolatry once again. We come down to the days of the kings. One of the things to Saul's credit is that he did what regarding idolatry and everything associated with it? He purged the land of it, so much so that when God anoints David through Samuel, anoints David to be his successor, the Spirit of God comes upon David and departs from Saul. He has to hunt to find a necromancer, a witch, the witch of Endor, as we call her. He has to hunt just to find somebody. He'd done a pretty thorough job of purging the land of everything associated with idolatry and divination and all of those things that were trappings of idolatry. During the reign of David, those things were not tolerated. But Solomon is the one who begins to import idolatry into the land of promise. And it's because of the influence of his multitude of foreign wives. And it's not merely Solomon indulging their whims, their beliefs, it's Solomon participating in them. Did he repent from that? I don't know. Do the books of Ecclesiastes and the Proverbs, do those date from before or after that period in his life? I don't know. I don't know. But here we have the division of the kingdom. And the record shows us 20 kings in the north, 20 kings in the south. There are 5 separate dynasties, if memory serves me correctly, in the north, only 1 in the south. Every king from Jeroboam forward in the north is evil, unrighteous, idolatrous, ungodly. Some more than others, but there are no good kings in the north. In the south, you have a balance, not quite 50-50. You've got 12 bad and 8 that are varying shades of not quite so bad to actually pretty good to really good. But only a couple of them fall into the really, really good category. It's interesting to note that for all of the persistent and consistent idolatry in the north, even the importation by Ahab through Jezebel of the worship of Baal and the Asherah in the north, there's no indication that Israel, the northern kingdom, ever went as far into degradation and idolatry as Judah did. There's no record of any of the kings of the north or any of the people in the north engaging in human sacrifice. But we find that in the south, and not just among people in the south, but one of the kings himself, Manasseh, engaging in this. Now, with respect to the books of Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, these, as I said, these appear to have been written after Judah returns from Babylonian exile. And this after Judah returns also applies to Israel, because remember, Cyrus's decree says that Judah and anybody associated with Judah, which would be Israel, the 12 tribes, the other 10 tribes, can return. Bear in mind, most Hebrews never returned. After captivity, most religious Jews, most people who were Jewish by culture, by religion, by family background, most Hebrew people never lived in the promised land again. Even by the time of Jesus in the 1st century, not more than half of all Hebrew people, and probably many fewer than that, actually, probably a much smaller percentage of all the Hebrew people in the world at that time. It's estimated that in the Roman Empire, roughly 5 to 7% of all of the inhabitants of the Roman Empire were Jews or Hebrew descendants. not more than half of those, and probably a much smaller percentage, actually lived in Judah. From captivity forward, most Hebrews, most Jews would be scattered throughout the Gentile world. And their association with Judaism as a religion would not be based on the temple or on the promised land, but on the synagogues, the congregations that they established in the neighborhoods that they colonized throughout the Gentile world. From the time of captivity down to the 2nd century AD, and really on through the whole European history of Judaism as well, these people, these former captives and their descendants, would always cluster, somewhat isolated, somewhat segregated from the Gentile world around them. You find that even here in Atlanta, which has one of the oldest Jewish populations in the United States. There are entire neighborhoods that are largely, not exclusively, but largely Jewish neighborhoods. And that's not enforced as it was in the Middle Ages in some parts of Europe. That's by choice in this country. And that was their custom as a way of preserving their cultural and customary identity. Chronicles is written as I said, basically as a history book for those who returned. Now, it would certainly become known to all of the Jews throughout the world, ultimately, and its purpose is to remind them of their identity and their history, and particularly to remind them of how they had come into captivity, what caused that captivity and exile, what led to it, and the goodness, the graciousness of God in bringing them out of it. It records specifically the lineage and the history of the nation of Judah. There's very little reference to Israel after the division under Rehoboam and Jeroboam. They remind us the lineage given here, the record given here is very similar to Luke's record of the lineage of Jesus, because it goes all the way back to the very beginning. And the purpose of the Chronicles, in distinction to the record of the Kings, is to remind the people of Judah, those returned exiles, and then ultimately all of their kinfolks out in the Gentile world, that God is always faithful. God is always consistent and dependable to fulfill his promises. He had promised them restoration. When Ezekiel was contending with the elders of Israel already in captivity in the regions of the city of Babylon, where they had been forcibly resettled, the elders were saying, well, maybe, first they argued that as long as the temple stood, Ezekiel's prophecies of a long captivity could not be right. Then after the temple was destroyed, after Jerusalem was obliterated, they begin to question, perhaps our God was only an imagination on our part. And Ezekiel then spends the second half of his ministry reassuring and reminding them that God promised and God would keep his promises. And the restoration then vindicates his reassurances and his emphasis there. Now, go back to 1 Kings for a minute. And in 1 Kings, what you see, the lesson to draw out of 1 Kings, as we come from Saul through David to Solomon, and then from Solomon down to Rehoboam and Jeroboam, what we see in 1 Kings is the tragedy of division among God's people. Chapters 1 through 11 of 1 Kings are basically a parallel, not quite word for word, but very close to 2 Chronicles chapters 1 through 9. They tell us about Solomon. Solomon is the last king who rules over all 12 tribes as one contiguous nation. But you pick up in 1 Kings chapter 12, and now we come to Rehoboam. 2 Chronicles chapter 10, Rehoboam. And we see that it's Rehoboam's arrogance and his ego that divides the nation, leads to the division of the nation. 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 38, before that takes place, before it actually occurs, God makes Jeroboam a proposition, makes him a promise, really. If you will trust me, if you'll be faithful to me, I'll bless you and establish you and your house, your family, your descendants, just like David. I'll make you the same deal I made with David, basically. Jeroboam could have had his descendants on the throne as long as there was a kingdom, if he had trusted God. Jeroboam no sooner is crowned king and ensconced on his throne than he establishes what would be the characteristic for his nation from that moment forward, a pattern of disobedience to God, a pattern of disregard for God that stays in place, that continues until the Assyrians destroy his nation and take it away into captivity in 721 BC. Now, Solomon's rule over the 12 tribes begins with the tension created by Adonijah, his older brother. Adonijah, like Absalom before him, less militantly, but no less greedily, Adonijah tries to seize the throne for himself. This takes us back to 1 Kings chapter 1. And it's right here in verses 10 and 11 that Nathan the prophet exposes him, draws in Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon, and we learn that it was God who had promised that Solomon, not Adonijah, would be David's successor. This is significant because this takes the sons out of order. Solomon appears to be the youngest son at this point, roughly speaking, about 18 years old. Adonijah at this point was probably closer to 40 and would have assumed as the oldest surviving son that the crown would come to him. And when it did not, it caused strife within the nation. Now, the important point is that Solomon ultimately, David had promised Bathsheba, but Solomon was ultimately God's choice, not simply David's. And when he becomes king after David's death, he removes Adonijah. Adonijah ultimately winds up being executed. And Abiathar and Joab and all of those folks that had been in some way connected with some of the mischief and the trouble and the heartache that attended the second part of David's rulership, second half of his reign. You see his great potential, Solomon's, as a wise ruler. He responds to God's offer. Ask whatever you want. Somebody writes you a blank check for anything your heart desires. What are you going to fill in on the pay to line, on the amount line? Talk about potential for gratifying your heart's desires. Ask what you want and I'll give it to you. Wow. And we see just what potential Solomon had when he says, give me wisdom to reign over this people. Give me an understanding heart. He was properly intimidated by the prospect of ruling God's people. It was appropriate for him to ask such things. And God then pours out blessing in addition to the wisdom that he asked. The prayer that he offers then, when he completes the construction of the temple, now his own palace is going to take several more years, but when he completes the construction of the temple after 7 years, the prayer of dedication that he offers is a model of humility, a model of a humble spirit before God. It's also a prophetic prayer. This is in 1 Kings chapter 8. It's a prophetic prayer in that it notes that God's people could be exiled for sin, could be cast out of the land. You look at verses 46 through 50. And in fact, what happens about 300 years after Solomon's reign, God's people are exiled in Babylon because of their sin. You look at 1 Kings chapter 11, and here the epitaph for Solomon's life is, he loved many foreign women. Now, the Queen of Sheba said of his wisdom, his understanding, his brilliance, inspired by God, the half has not been told. But even with all that God had given him, God did not take away temptation and the potential for sin. And at some point, we see Solomon plunge both hands fully into all that the temptations of the world have to offer. It may well be that Ecclesiastes is written as a retrospective at the end of Solomon's life. Have I been saying Saul all this time? Okay. It may well be that Ecclesiastes is a retrospective at the end of Solomon's life, because the basic message, the basic theme that's expressed in Ecclesiastes is, I looked for the meaning of life under the sun. What's the purpose of my life in this world? I looked for meaning, for purpose, for focus, for reason in wine and women and song, in power and politics and building and construction and all of these things. And I didn't find satisfaction. I didn't find purpose. I didn't find meaning in any of those things. And so you come down to the end of Ecclesiastes, and how does Solomon summarize it? This is the end, or this is the sum of my investigation. This is the conclusion. Everything, all the evidence has been examined. Everything has been heard. Here's what it comes down to. Reverence God, fear God, and keep his commandments. This is the whole. The King James Version doesn't actually do us a favor when it supplies the word duty in italics there. This is the whole of man. This is the sum of what it is to be what God wants you to be. Fear God and keep his commandments. Now, chapter 11 of 1 Kings also introduces us to the man who would rule those 10 northern tribes after Solomon's death. And of course, that's Jeroboam that we talked about a moment ago. When Rehoboam becomes king, he's foolish. He proposes to tighten the screws, raise the taxes on the people, show them who's boss, and 10 tribes revolt and leave. This is according to the will of God. This had already been prophesied. Verse 15 tells us this is according to the word of the Lord. The two nations, north and south, Israel and Judah, almost come to civil war at this point. God does not allow them to fight. And Jeroboam shows that he is an astute politician, but not a very godly man at this point, when he establishes his own rival religion for the kingdom of Israel. Behold, Israel, your gods that brought you out of Egypt. From this point on, every reference to Jeroboam will be Jeroboam who taught Israel to sin. Okay, it's 10 till 7 now. So it's a convenient moment to take a break, and then we'll go into the various kings of the two rival kingdoms after Rehoboam and Jeroboam. So we'll take 15 minutes at this point. Questions or comments before we do? Yes, ma'am.
You know, when you said about, you know, the scattered, all the Jews, when they got scattered, is that what that's referring to in Peter? You know, it was written to the scattered.
Actually, in First Peter, when Peter addresses those of the diaspora or the dispersion, certainly that would have its roots all the way back here in the days of Assyrian and Babylonian captivities. But more specifically, that would be a reference to those scattered there in the first century, not so much because of persecution, but because of economic and social circumstances as well.
Okay.
Certainly it has roots in this original dispersion, though, that goes back to captivity.
David, why do you think the people who are Rehoboam, they don't have any lot in David's house?
Okay, when Jeroboam and the representatives of the 10 northern tribes come to Rehoboam and say, you know, lighten our load, let up on us, and we'll serve you. And then he says, no, I'm going to tighten the screws. Oh, we have no partner lot in this. In other words, that's basically a way of saying we don't have anything to lose by staying loyal to you. We don't have anything to gain by staying loyal to you. We don't have anything to lose by leaving you. We have neither partner lot in this. You're acting like you're somebody special, which he was, progenitor of Christ. But their perspective from a worldly point of view is, we don't have anything to lose by leaving. You're not doing us any favors. You're not benefiting us as our king. So we don't have any part. Everything you're doing as king is to your own advantage, not to our benefit. And that's the gist of that statement. We have neither part nor lot to your own tents. Okay, we'll take 15 minutes. Let's get started. Yeah, that was like 2 minutes.
You're having flies.
All right, so let's move forward. We had talked about the division of Israel into two kingdoms, Israel and Judah, in the days of Rehoboam and Jeroboam. When Jeroboam separates the 10 tribes from Rehoboam's rulership, he selects Shechem, where Abraham had originally settled hundreds of years before, as his capital, buys the property, fortifies it. And you look in chapter 12 in 1 Kings, and in verses 25, 26, 27, notice he says, let me flip one more page here. Jeroboam built Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived there. And he went out from there and built Penuel. And Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom will turn back to the house of David. If this people go up to offer sacrifices in the temple of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will turn again to their Lord, to Rehoboam, king of Judah. And they will kill me and return to Rehoboam, king of Judah. So the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold. It wasn't entirely his idea. He consulted with others, what shall we do? And the consensus is, let's create a competitive religion. Now these verses 26 and 27, Jeroboam's insecurity are the key to all of the illegal changes that he makes in worship. What he does is he tries to make religion easy. Be your own priesthood. Whoever wants to can be a priest. Don't go all the way up to Jerusalem. It's uphill all the way from anywhere in the country, basically. Don't go. It's too much trouble to go to Jerusalem. Worship at Dan, worship at Bethel. Dan in the far north, Bethel to the south in the territory of Simeon. It's too much trouble. Notice, this is not altogether false religion. It's partly false religion. But more than that, it's false worship. It's going through the motions. It's salving your own conscience, not actually worshiping. Bethel, we say Bethel in Simeon. Bethel actually was in the territory of the tribe of Benjamin, but it's on the border. It's in Joshua chapter 18. It belongs to Benjamin, but it's convenient to Simeon. One of the things we don't think about, we think of Israel as the northern kingdom, but in fact, we might ought to call it the encompassing kingdom, because the territory of Simeon was in the Negev to the south of Judah. And these people were loyal to Jeroboam. Now, in generations to come, many of the Simeonites would evidently migrate north or simply assimilate with either native peoples or be assimilated into Judah. And thus, Israel does, for all practical purposes, become the northern kingdom. But in the beginning, Israel actually surrounded Judah north and south. And so one of the altars is placed conveniently to those numerous Israelites who are in the south. There also perhaps is an element of convenience to those in Judah who might not appreciate Rehoboam's rulership as well. But regardless, all that Jeroboam does to secure his kingdom consists in sin. And everything he does is an expression of his distrust, his lack of trust in God. God had promised, I'll secure your dynasty if you'll just be faithful. And Jeroboam did not trust God. That's really what this all comes down to. Now, you get into chapter 13, God immediately, it seems, sends a prophet, a man of God. His name is not given. Comes out of Judah, prophesies the desecration of Jeroboam's altars, mentions Josiah by name, who would come 330 to 340 years later. And the name, as well as the prophecy, serve as proof of the prophecy, confirmation. When Josiah comes along, those faithful in his day can point to what he's doing and say, this is that which the man of God foretold to Jeroboam. Of course, by the time Josiah comes along, the northern kingdom is already gone into captivity to the Assyrians. But from this point, Jeroboam truly begins to put his kingdom above the Lord's authority. God acts immediately. Jeroboam is assaulted in a manner of speaking here. He threatens the man of God, and he's immediately affected by God, and then released from his withered hand. But that does not turn him back to God. We see the treachery of the old prophet in leading this young man to his death. Why did the young man not confirm with God what he was being told? He is as susceptible to temptation. He is as susceptible to deception as any of the rest of us would be. Think about Joshua in Joshua chapter 9 with the Gibeonites. What did the Gibeonites tell Joshua and the elders of Israel when they first appeared? Oh, we're from a long, long, long way away. This bread was fresh, hot out of the oven. Our clothes were brand new. Our shoes were brand new. And they lived about 3 days away. It must have been really, really rough 3 days for the bread to get stale and crumbly and clothes to wear out. Joshua's mistake was not to confirm with God what he was being told. Likewise, here, the young prophet's mistake was not to confirm with God what he was being told. It cost him his life. Now in chapter 14, you have the record of the reign and the death of Jeroboam, the story of Jeroboam in a manner of speaking. And you won't find this in Chronicles by virtue of the fact that this pertains to the unfaithful kingdom, the 10 tribes, not the 2. And Jeroboam has a son, Abijah. He's ill, and perhaps Ahijah, the old prophet who had given Jeroboam good news of receiving the kingdom, the one who had actually been sent to anoint him with oil. Maybe Ahijah will have some good news for him. So why then does he send his wife instead of going himself? And why does he command her to disguise herself? He knows he's on God's wrong side. One of the fascinating things in all of the record of the Northern Kingdom, for me as a student, one of the fascinating things is to see how consistently they know they are in the wrong with God. Almost every generation, almost every king, at some point, there is some recognition. I know I am on God's wrong side, that God is real, that God's in charge, and I'm on his wrong side, but I'm going to stay here anyway. How many people do we encounter who seem to go through life with that same spirit, that same attitude? Well, I know what the Bible says. I know what God wants, but I'm going to do what I want anyway. So Benji?
You say, why did he send a wife or not go himself? I was just thinking what you were thinking. The fact that Ahijah told him that he would get the 10 tribes. If God told him that, then clearly he knows that I'm not doing it right by
There
God.
you go.
You know, and then the other thing about what he said that God told him to do right. If you do right, I'll be with you.
There you go.
You know?
If you just do what I tell you to, everything will go fine. And they just refuse. Why disguise yourself? You can't hide from God. Think about David's words in the Psalms. If I go into the highest mountaintop, if I go to the deepest spot in the ocean, if I go into the grave, behold, thou art there. There's nowhere to hide from God. Now, Ahijah, the prophet, he's blind with old age, but God reveals what's going on and sends a message for the king through this prophet. All the males in Jeroboam's house will die, from upper to lower, from the king on down to the one that sweeps refuse, or literally sweeps the dung out of the house. And none of them will die an honorable death. And here's how you know it'll come to pass. You look down here at verse 12 in chapter 14. Here's the proof. Go to your house. When your feet enter the city, the child, that's Abijah, the child will die. Can you imagine what that must have felt like for the mother to receive that message? As soon as your feet enter the city, the child will die. That would be strong incentive in one sense. Never go home, never see my child again, at least to be alive. But she goes home. Jeroboam dies as well after reigning for 22 years. Nadab, his son, becomes king, and Nadab is no better. Now, in the meantime, the rest of chapter 14, you have the reign of Rehoboam. And Rehoboam's mother was an Amorite woman named Naamah, and he reigns for 17 years. Now, there's a little note here, something to think about. The queen mother of every king in Judah is named. And that indicates, if nothing else, the power that a wife has over her husband, and more specifically over her son, the influence that she has over her sons. What official capacity would the mother of the king have in a nation that is a kingdom? She'd be an ornament, a figurehead, you would think. And yet, every queen mother is named because a mother has influence over her son, normally. There will be some exceptions. Now, Notice how she must have trained him. Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, reigned in Judah, was 41 years old when he began to reign, reigned 17 years in Jerusalem, the city the Lord had chosen. His mother's name was Naamah the Ammonite. Judah did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and provoked him to jealousy with their sins that they committed more than all that their fathers had done. Well, who's responsible for that? Rehoboam. But how is it that Rehoboam learned that? Well, his father was awfully self-indulgent. But who did the child rearing? Mama had some influence in that. We read in 2 Chronicles chapter 11, the parallel here about Rehoboam's fortifications and his family and how he wanted to make his son Abijah the king and all of the things that go on during his reign. High places are brought back, places of idol worship. Now, in the days of Joshua, from Joshua down through Samuel, the people worshiped and sacrificed in the high places. But who were they worshiping and to whom were they sacrificing? Mostly it was to God. And they didn't have a temple, so that was tolerable to God. That was acceptable to God. Here in Rehoboam's day, what begins to take place is the worship of idols. They erect sacred pillars, that is, images, monuments wherever they imagined that they had received revelation. And you have perverted persons mentioned in this context. Sodomites, practice of ungodly sexual things. All of the evils that are practiced by the heathens. You read here in 2 Chronicles chapter 11 that Shishak comes from Egypt and plunders Jerusalem because Judah had sinned against the Lord, verses 2 through 12. But he is a plunderer, not a destroyer. He takes away enormous quantities of wealth that had been accumulated in Solomon's day. And you find Rehoboam replacing the golden shields that were taken away with brass. And now the brass shields are kept under guard, under lock and key in the guardhouse instead of in the Forest of Lebanon house, instead of on display. You're going to guard something that has comparatively no value because something that had real value was taken away because you weren't faithful. And so Rehoboam finally comes to his death at the end of 2 Chronicles chapter 11, and there's war between the nations, not so much physical violent conflict as there is animosity between the two nations, rivalry and gamesmanship, you might say. And Abijah, his son, becomes king in his stead. And so we read then in chapter 15 of 2 Chronicles and chapter 15 of 1 Kings about Abijah and Asa, the successors to Rehoboam. Abijah, an evil king. But notice in verses 4 and 5 in 1 Kings 15, God allowed him to reign in spite of his evil for David's sake. Look at verses 4 and 5 in chapter 15 of 1 Kings for just a moment. You see in verse 3, he walked in all the sins that his father did before him. His heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father. Nevertheless, for David's sake, the Lord his God gave him a lamp in Jerusalem, setting up his son after him and establishing Jerusalem, because David did what was right in the eyes of the Lord and did not turn aside from anything that he commanded him all the days of his life, except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. The light or the lamp is his son Asa, who will turn out to be a different character altogether. Evil king spawns a good king. But I want you to think about that statement, for the sake of David. What had God promised David?
House would always be on the throne.
His house would rule. God gives Abijam a light. God gives him tolerance, you might say, patience, to fulfill that promise to David, to allow time for Asa to become old enough to reign, maybe even to allow time for Asa to be born so that he can become old enough to reign, to preserve intact David's lineage for the coming of the Messiah. That's the ultimate for the sake of David, to preserve intact the lineage of the Messiah. So we come to Asa. The same mother's name is used here as for Abijam. That's possible, two women of the same name. I mean, there's more than one David in the world, more than one Michael in the world. We've got 3 Michaels just in this class. It's possible two women shared the same name. More likely, this is a reference to Abijam's mother still living after his death and still exercising influence over her descendants. Notice that there is no other name given for Asa's mother. Maybe she died as a young woman, maybe not. Regardless, Maacah, Abijam's mother, is an evil influence, and Asa is a good king. You pick up here in verses 14 and 15 in chapter 15 of First Kings. Asa is a good man, a good king. He eliminates the homosexuality that had been tolerated. He removes the idols of false gods in the high places. And because his grandmother, the queen mother, is dedicated to idolatry, he deposes her as well. Now, the high places are not removed, and that may be a reference to high places where God is being worshiped, because otherwise we would presume that they'd be removed. He builds fortified cities. He gives many gifts to the temple for the work of the Lord. He defeats Zerah and the Ethiopians, prospers in a lot of ways. God blesses him. But Judah has turned away from God during his father's reign. And the prophet Azariah counsels him, you turn the nation back to God. Be strong and you'll find him. It's at this point that we see the two nations, Israel and Judah, actually beginning to come into some violent conflict, with Baasha on the throne in Israel. Baasha tries to basically lay siege to Judah, to circle up, to encircle the whole nation. And that's an act of war. And it's at this point that Asa does something foolish. Understandable from a human point of view, but foolish nonetheless. He sends a bribe to Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, to go to war with Israel and relieve pressure on Judah. And that works, it's effective. Baasha quits his project, and Asa goes out and loots and plunders all the building material and uses it to fortify Geba and Mizpah. But Hanani, however you want to pronounce his name, the prophet comes and basically says, you should have trusted God instead of taking matters into your own hands. And for the first time, we see Asa do something not very sensible, not very godlike. He imprisons God's man, Hanani, and oppresses some of the people. And then he's diseased in his feet. What's the disease in his feet? I don't know. Gout, edema, ulcerations, who knows? And finally he dies, and Jehoshaphat, his son, reigns in his place. Now, Jehoshaphat, likewise, Jehoshaphat is not a bad guy overall. In some respects, he's not as good as his father. In the meantime, we have moved from Nadab through Baasha to Elah in Israel. We've seen change of dynasties. We've seen murder and so forth. And Baasha, who is king at this point in Israel, just like every other king of Israel, is an evil man, an evil king. He slaughters every male descendant of Jeroboam's family, just according to the prophecy. The Lord predicted that previously. And you have enmity, you have conflict that continues between Judah and Israel all through this time. Baasha is no better than Jeroboam or Nadab because of his sinning, just like Jeroboam. It's prophesied that his family will likewise be cut off. And when he dies, Eli, his son, reigns. And in chapter 16, 1 Kings, you have the reign of Eli. Well, guess what? Baasha's house is going to be eliminated. He was evil like Jeroboam. He slaughtered the house of Jeroboam. His extermination of Jeroboam's house was not out of any desire to honor God or fulfill God's prophecy. It was done with selfish interests. The fact that it fulfilled prophecy, as far as he was concerned, was incidental. It was done with his own selfish interests. God condemned him not for having done it, because that was what God had foretold, but for having done it from the wrong motive, having done it for his own interests and not out of obedience to God. Now, Elah reigns for 2 years and then is replaced by Zimri through treason. Zimri plots against him, and all the house of Baasha then is eliminated, because what had Baasha done? He just led Israel farther into sin, into idolatry. You have Zimri and Omri. You have civil war within Israel between these two. The people don't accept Zimri. They make Omri king. Omri captures Tirzah, and Zimri burns the palace down in Shechem over himself. And the kingdom of Israel is then divided. At one point, you have 3 different men. Now, Zimri doesn't last, but after Zimri, you have Tibni, co-regent basically with Omri. You have 2 kings at the same time, or 2 rulers at the same time. It's at this point, Omri purchases Samaria, and this is going to become the capital of Israel from this point on, until it's destroyed and the people are dispersed by the Assyrians. Omri is the worst so far, but you look at the end of chapter 16 in verses 25 through 28, Omri did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, did more evil than all who were before him, walked in all the way of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, and the sins that he made Israel to sin, provoking the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger by their idols. And then he dies and slept with his fathers, buried in Samaria, and along comes Ahab. Omri was the worst so far, but beware his son. Ahab is going to set a new low water mark for ungodliness in Israel. The irony of this, 1 Kings chapter 16 down to 2 Kings chapter 9, basically, is that beginning with Ahab, there is a period of comparative alliance between Israel and Judah. Remember, we had Baasha trying to seal up or encircle Judah so that they'd be cut off from any help outside of Israel, so he could control them, basically. Well, that didn't work. It wasn't God's plan, and it certainly wasn't I've lost the name of the king in Judah. No. Asa. It wasn't God's plan. It certainly wasn't Asa's plan. Asa didn't follow God in trusting him, but his actions were functionally effective in getting the pressure off. But here, at this point, we're going to begin to see, instead of competition and strife, alliance, working together at times. working for mutual benefit from a human point of view. Now, that might sound like a good thing, but it never is, because Israel, the northern kingdom, never recants their idolatry. And it's Ahab who sort of ushers in this period of sort of alliance, who was also responsible for introducing outright idolatry with no reference whatever to Israel's history and God's participation in it, into the land of Israel through Jezebel. But it's also Ahab who begins to make alliances and family connections with Jehoshaphat in Judah. And the royal families wind up intermarrying. And that's never a good thing for Judah. It's never a good influence for Judah. So, in chapter 16, we have the beginning of Ahab's reign. And the thing that stands out about Ahab is that if Omri was as bad as anybody had ever been in Israel, Ahab's going to make him look like a piker by comparison. Ahab is worse than everybody, marries Jezebel, who is a Sidonian princess, and brings all manner of idolatry with her. And her idols become, at this point, the dominant idols in Israel, Baal and Asherah, the male and female fertility gods of the Phoenicians, basically. Now, we also find here in chapter 16, at the end of the chapter, verse 34, the rebuilding of Jericho by Hiel of Bethel, the Bethelite, and prophecy established in the curse that Joshua had put on that city way back in Joshua chapter 6. That prophecy is fulfilled. It costs Hiel, the son, his firstborn son, Abiram, in the laying of the foundations. And once they complete that and set up the gates, which would be basically the finishing touches, it cost him his youngest son, Segub. Now, how did the deaths of the sons come about? I don't know. But the fact of the matter is that the prophecy had been made, the curse had been laid, and the people should have been acutely aware of it and avoided that area. Remember, in the days of David, when some of his ambassadors, some of his young men had been humiliated and shamed by a foreign king, he let them stay in that otherwise desolated area until their beards grew back and their hair grew back, so that they wouldn't appear shamed and humiliated in public before their own people. So this should have remained a desolate region. And in fact, Hiel takes it upon himself to rebuild it. Now, Jericho will be an established inhabited city pretty much from this point on, all through Old Testament and into New Testament history. Remember, Jesus tells of a man going from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he falls among thieves, is beaten, stripped, and left for dead. And who is it? Not the priest, not the Levite, the humble, lowly Samaritan that takes care of him. Who was his neighbor? Well, it wasn't the priest and the Levite. It's at this point in chapter 17 that we're introduced to Elijah, the prophet, and we see Elijah and Ahab at odds with each other, because Elijah does what? Represents God. And Ahab's perspective on Elijah: you're the one who is the source of trouble in Israel. You're my problem. You are the one who is causing me trouble among my people, with my people. So let me get over here to where I need to be in my notes. So at this point, we find conflict between the two. We find Ahab considering him an enemy by virtue of the fact that what does Elijah do? Speaks the truth, tells him the truth. And that does not sit well with Ahab. Of course, every time Elijah confronts Ahab, it's not Ahab who's vindicated, but Elijah. We find the conflict after a 3.5-year drought. The conflict comes to a head really on Mount Carmel. Bring up your false prophets of Baal and prophets of the Asherah, and we'll see who's God. And of course, the contest, as you will, humiliates the priests of the false god and vindicates Elijah and ultimately God. Elijah then, rain comes, he is vindicated, justified. Ahab is reaping the benefits, as it were, finally, of God relenting a little bit. And it's at this point that Jezebel steps into the picture, threatens Elijah, and you see a godly man go from the pinnacle of victory to the valley of despair almost in a matter of moments. And Elijah flees, complaining to God, I'm the only one that's faithful, when he knows that's not in fact true.
That's what I felt.
Begging God, just let me die. You kind of have to wonder, after God speaks to him, not in the fire, not in the earthquake, not in the great storm, but in a quiet voice, go back and do the work that I've sent for you, and then I'm going to take you, appoint a prophet in your place. You kind of have to wonder if Elijah wasn't a little bit, huh? What? You're going to do what I asked you to do? You're going to take me, Lord? But he does complete his assignment and then is replaced by Elisha. Now, Ahab is eventually replaced, and his dynasty is going to be replaced as well. What's notable about the change of dynasty is the only wife we see for Ahab is Jezebel. Clearly he had more, because she didn't live long enough to bear him 70 sons who were all executed by his successor, which is Jehu, who replaces his dynasty. Now, our time is getting away, so let me move forward a little bit. You remember the matter of Naboth and his vineyard and so forth. Come into 2 Kings, and it's here that Elijah denounces Ahaziah. Ahaziah, the successor, has fallen through a window, wants to know if he's going to recover, and that ain't going to happen. That is not going to transpire. Go inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron. Why are you asking a God that doesn't exist? Why don't you ask the real God? Well, who told you this? And they described Elijah. He knows from the description exactly who this was. It's Elijah the Tishbite. And go fetch him for me. A company of 50 men. The king says, come, fire from heaven. Another company of 50 men. The king says, come, fire from heaven. Third time, the captain of the third group has got a little more sense, or maybe a little more humility. Please come, don't destroy us. And he comes. And then in chapter 2 of 2 Kings, we see Elijah, having completed everything that God has given him to do. Elijah now is taken up bodily into heaven, and Elisha becomes his successor. He is given the double portion, the firstborn's share of Elijah's authority and power. The sons of the prophets who have seen them together accept him as their new prophet, their new leader. And we have several miracles recorded that Elisha performs in the course of his priestly duties. Now, the things that stand out about Elisha are his association with the Shunammite woman and the widow of one of the sons of the prophets and her oil, providing for them, taking care of them, and purifying the meal, the stew that was deadly, and curing the water and so forth. But the thing that stands out with Elisha has got to be Naaman. Naaman, the Syrian captain, who's a leper. We know the story. Naaman learns through a captured Hebrew girl, his wife's maid, that there's a prophet in Israel who can cure him. Now, in the Gentile economy, in idol worshiping nations, it would be presumed that the king controls the prophets and the prophets do the king's bidding. So when Naaman comes from Syria to Israel, he doesn't come directly to Elisha. He may not even at this point know Elisha's name. He just knows there's a prophet there. So he comes not in search of the prophet, but he comes to the king. And the king perceives this as merely a ploy to pick a fight, as it were. But Elisha sends word, send him to me. And he gives him the prescription for healing. Really simple. Dip 7 times in the River Jordan. A test of his faith, in a manner of speaking. Now, what does Naaman know of the God of Israel, the true God of Israel? Functionally nothing, except that his wife's maid said there's a prophet that can heal him. And he came ready to pay an enormous price. Test of his faith. Go dip 7 times in the River Jordan and you'll be healed. And it won't cost you anything. Elisha didn't even come out to greet him personally, simply sent him the prescription, phoned it in, you might say, through Gehazi. Naaman almost went home with his leprosy. His servants prevailed on him. You got nothing to lose, boss. And so he put God to the test, and God came through. But now Gehazi intervenes, concocts a story to get some of the reward that Elisha had not accepted, because it wasn't Elisha that did the miracle, it was God. Concocts a story to get some of it for himself. And what does he get along with it? Naaman's leprosy. And he goes out white like snow, it says at the end of chapter 5. In chapter 6, we have a second incidence of the chariots of fire, the horses and the chariots of fire. In this circumstance, when the king of Syria has surrounded Israel, and one of Elisha's servants is intimidated. You come down here to verse 15. The servant of the man of God rose early in the morning, went out. An army with horses and chariots was all around the city. What shall we do? Don't be afraid. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them. Elisha prayed, Lord, please open his eyes. The Lord opened the young man's eyes, and he saw, behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. God was on their side, and Ben-Hadad is defeated and defeated and defeated in rapid succession. Even though they are under siege and starving, ultimately they're delivered, just as Elisha promises in chapter 7. The Shunammite in chapter 8, the woman who had sheltered him and provided for him, has her land restored after it's taken away. And then we see a change in rulership to Jehoram in Judah and Ahaziah, and then Jehu in Israel. And it's Jehu who is tasked with cutting off the offspring of Ahab to eliminate them because of their unrighteousness. Now, Jehu will get his own in time. He'll get his own comeuppance. But notice in chapter 9 of 2 Kings, Jehu doesn't just assassinate the ruling family in Israel. What has taken place during the reign of Ahab and several kings in Judah? They've intermarried. And so Jehu is responsible for the assassination of Joram and Ahaziah from Judah, as well as Ahab's offspring. So basically, all of those who are connected to Ahab in both kingdoms wind up being eliminated. It's a brutal way. It's a rough way of purging out Ahab's influence, but it's very effective. And it's at this point that Jezebel also gets her comeuppance when Jehu comes to Jezreel, and she is thrown down, and nothing is left of her when the dogs get finished and the birds and so forth. Nothing is left but her skull and the soles of her hands and feet. And it's at this point that all of Ahab's descendants are slaughtered. Now, at this point, we're fast approaching the end of the northern kingdom. Jehu is going to eliminate Baal worship in Israel. Jehu probably comes closer to being a good king than any other king of Israel, because he does get rid of the worship of Baal. He does rid Israel of foreign idolatry, but he does nothing to rid them of native idolatry. Basically, will worship the religion of Jeroboam. His loyalty is to his nation, not to God. And so he's going to purge out outside influences, but he's not going to restore godly influences. It's at this point in Judah that something extraordinary takes place. Ahaziah has been assassinated because of his connection to the house of Ahab, basically, by Jehu. And his mother, Athaliah, seizes power and for 6 years reigns in Jerusalem. We have to wonder, how could the elders of Judah tolerate such a thing, except she was in the right place at the right time to seize power, to be in control. She is an evil woman and sets out to eliminate all of her own offspring and succeeds, except for 1-year-old Joash, who is hidden away for 6 years until he's old enough, he's weaned, he can dress himself, he can speak. He is a child, but he has the guidance of Jehoiada, the high priest. And at that point, at age 7, he is crowned king, and Athaliah is deposed and executed. Joash, as he's sometimes called, is basically a good king for most of his reign. He repairs the temple. He improves things. He turns the people back toward God, generally speaking. And then he dies to be replaced by Jehoahaz. It's at this time frame that Elisha is going to pass into history. Elisha is going to die as well. Jehoash, another Jehoash, reigns in Israel. You have 2 kings, the same name at the same time in 2 different kingdoms, neighboring kingdoms. Jehoash reigns in Israel, and Elisha summons Jehoash of Israel, who comes to him. One of the things to bear in mind in all of this is that in spite of Israel's faithlessness, in spite of the ungodliness of its kings, what does God continue to do? He sends them prophet after prophet after prophet after prophet. God never stops trying to restore Israel. If you'll do good, if you'll do right, I'll receive you back to myself. I'll bless you. I'll take care of you. Trust me. And they never, never, never do. Good lesson, good sermon you can preach there about the importance of trusting God and what trust really is. You flip over to Hebrews and you read about the children of Israel not being able to enter the promised land in the generation of slaves that came out of Egypt. And what does the Hebrews writer tell us there? They did not obey, and they were not able to enter in because of unbelief. In the space of 2 verses, he tells us, he defines for us what trusting God is, what believing God is. Obey. Take him at his word. Put him to the test. If you do what he says, he'll do what he promises. But in Israel, they never would.
Not only that, I mean, the desire that God has for them is the same desire that he has for you and for me and for every, I'd have thrown my hands up and, a long time ago, but he desires us and to have that
Exactly.
mindset that he's not, that there's nothing that I've done because he desires me to come back and repent and to be aligned with him, his desire to do that, to put anything out there, to put Christ out there for him.
Absolutely.
His desire, that's what I see here.
Well, and you think about the words of Paul, 1 Timothy chapter 2 and what is it, verse 4, and the words of Peter in 2 Peter chapter 3 about verse 4 or 5. God is not willing that any should perish. That's true in every generation. That's not just true in the first century. That's true in every moment in time. God is not willing. It's not God's design, his intention for anyone to be lost. Think about Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 25 concerning hell. What does he say about hell? It's prepared for the devil and his angels, not for us. God didn't create hell. God didn't set aside hell. God did not withdraw his presence from a I don't know if area is really the right word because it's a spiritual existence, but God did not withdraw his presence from a place or a moment of existence for us. He did that for the devil and his angels to isolate them. But if we choose to be with them, he'll let us be. Yes, ma'am.
Until this, lately in your class, I just looking at trust a little different. It is a very sneaky sin. Because you don't have to be involved in all this stuff that people see, adultery, lying, stealing. Even as a Christian, you can just simply do what they did in the Bible, the world. But he didn't trust God. That was something huge. It led to all of this because he didn't trust. And the same as the children of Israel, it's like a sneaky thing. It's almost like something we don't know what we're doing, but it leads to all of this insecurity.
It is not an overt sin. It's a very covert sin. It's very much a sin of the inner man, the hidden man.
Yeah.
On the outside, you're going through all the motions. You show up every time the doors are open. You're there. You sing loud and participate, and you give and whatnot. But in your heart, there's a different person there.
You may not even know you're doing it. It's like you may not even know you're not trusting like you should.
It may not be.
Because you're going
I was going to say it may not be at the forefront of your mind, but it is a choice nonetheless. It is absolutely a choice. Okay. Here we have the death of Elisha, as I said, and Jehoash comes to him Isn't it interesting? Here is a man who is officially an idolater, whose official position is, I'm not going to worship the God of my far back ancestors, the God who actually delivered us and made a nation out of us. But he comes to a prophet of that God, 2 Kings 13, verse 14 and following, and weeps before him, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen, you're leaving me. And of course, this is the episode with the bow and arrows. Take the bow and the arrows, shoot an arrow, shoot another arrow, shoot another, strike the ground. And he strikes 3 times and stops. You should have kept beating the ground till I told you to quit, basically. If you'd have kept going, if you'd have kept beating the ground, you'd have made an end of the Syrians. As it is now, you win 3 battles, and that's as far as you'll go. And Elisha dies, and they buried him. And things are not good from this point forward. Hazael of Syria oppresses Israel. But notice at verse 23, the Lord was gracious, had compassion on them, turned toward them because of what? Not because of anything they did, because of something he did. He'd made a covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob that he would not destroy them. So he's going to preserve them in spite of their wickedness, in spite of their faithlessness, because God keeps faith even when we do not. If we are faithless, Paul says, he abides faithful. And so Hazael dies and Ben-Hadad becomes king. And at this point, things seem to turn around a little bit. Jehoash is actually able to reclaim some cities. 3 times Joash defeated Ben-Hadad and recovered the cities of Israel, but that's as far as it goes. That's the end of his success. And Amaziah becomes king in Judah. Amaziah is a good king. Did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. He's not as good as David, but he's better than a lot of them. And he did not put to death the children of people who had committed murder in the run up to his rulership. He was aware of the law of Moses, which that sets Amaziah head and shoulders above most of the other kings of Judah. How many of them seemingly didn't know beans from cornbread about what the law actually said? But you notice here in 2 Kings chapter 14, he did not put to death the children of the murderers, verse 6, according to what is written in the law of Moses, where the Lord commanded, fathers shall not be put to death because of their children, nor shall children be put to death because of their fathers, but each one shall bear his own sin. He was aware of what the law required, which is more than can be said for a lot of other kings. Amaziah lived 15 years after the death of Jehoash, the son of Jehoahaz, king of Israel, and then he dies. Now he's on balance, he's a pretty good king, but Amaziah is not, he's not perfect. When it comes to conflict between Israel and Judah, Amaziah is rather bullheaded. He and Joash, the king of Israel, faced one another at Beth Shemesh, and Judah was defeated because the Lord did not want them fighting. This brings us to Jeroboam II in Israel. And Jeroboam II, it's ironic. We talked about how that name, who would name their child Jeroboam? Well, in Israel, that wasn't a name associated with anything bad because they were idolaters. But Jeroboam, ironically, is the one who delivers Israel from some of their oppressors. How he fought, how he restored Damascus and Hamath to Judah in Israel. Jeroboam actually accomplished some sort of positive things because of the word of the Lord. The Lord would not blot out the name of Israel. He saved them by the hand of Jeroboam, the son of Joash. God uses people who do not honor him to accomplish his own purpose. Daniel would express it: God rules in the kingdoms of men, gives them to whomever he pleases, which really ought to be a sobering thought for 21st century Christians when we look at what's going on in the world around us and how the world is changing and sliding back toward the anarchy that is characteristic of most of human history. God is still in charge. Have you ever learned a lesson the hard way and look back on that and reflect, well, Lord, I know I needed to know that, but did I have to learn it that way? Did I have to learn it in such a rough fashion? Now, mind you, it's not the Lord being rough to us. It's the Lord allowing us the consequences of our own foolish will. Sometimes it takes that harsh experience to teach us to see things from God's point of view. God uses even people who do not cooperate with him to accomplish his purpose. That brings us to Azariah in Judah. And Azariah has the dubious distinction of reigning 52 years and is a pretty good king. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, 2 Kings chapter 15. For a man who reigned 52 years and was basically a good king, there's not much said about him here. But Azariah, Uzziah, as he's also known over in 2 Chronicles, has quite a bit going on. He reigns 52 years, according to 2 Chronicles chapter 26, in verse 2. He's called Uzziah there. And he makes war against the Philistines and prospers in that and so forth. But you come down to 2 Chronicles chapter 26 and you look at verse 16. When he was strong, he grew proud to his destruction. Somewhere in the course of this 52-year reign, evidently somewhere past the halfway point, his ego begins to inflate, and he takes it upon himself to go into the temple and perform the office of a priest on his own behalf. And the priests themselves interfere, confront him. It's not for you to do this. Go out. You've done wrong. It will bring you no honor from the Lord. It made him angry. And he became a leper. And from that point on, he has to live separate. He can't live in the palace. He can't live in the city. He's isolated. And Jotham, his son, reigns in his stead. Well, it's at this point then, as Uzziah or Azariah is king in Jerusalem, that we see the really what amounts to the run up to the end in Israel. Rapid succession of kings, fruit basket turnover in a manner of speaking. Zechariah, followed by Shallum, followed by Menachem, followed by Pekahiah, followed by Pekah in Israel. Just bang, 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 bang. And ultimately, Hoshea, the last. Ironically, the man whose name means Savior is the last king of Israel. And Israel, in the 9th year of Hoshea, is captured. Samaria is captured by the Assyrians. And notice in Second Kings rather, chapter 17 at verse 7, this occurred, that is the capture by Assyria. This occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and had feared other gods and walked in the customs of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel, and in the customs of the kings of Israel, the customs that the kings of Israel had practiced. And notice verse 9, the people of Israel did secretly against the Lord their God things that were not right. The people of Israel did secretly. Who did they hide it from? They didn't hide it from God. They did not hide it from God. There's nothing God does not see. They built for themselves high places in all their towns, from watchtower to fortified city, and set up pillars and Asherim, and so on and so on and so on. Look at verse 13. Yet the Lord warned Israel and Judah by every prophet and every seer. Turn from your evil ways, keep my commandments and my statutes in accordance with all the law that I commanded your fathers, that I sent to you by my servants, the prophets. But they would not listen. They would not listen. Stubborn as their fathers had been, who did not believe in the Lord their God. And so you come down here to verse 18. The Lord was very angry with Israel, removed them out of his sight. None was left but the tribe of Judah only. But then, just like, what was the guy's name? Billy Mays on TV. But wait, there's more. Judah also did not keep the commandments of the Lord their God, but walked in the customs that Israel had introduced. And Jeremiah will tell us that Judah was even more unfaithful than Israel. It's at this point that we read about the Assyrians resettling captured people in the territory of Israel, and the plague of lions, and them having to import a priest to teach them the customs of the land to abate the plague. Notice down here in chapter 17, at verse 34, 33, they feared the Lord, but also served their own gods. These are the transplanted people. These are not the Israelites. Heathen peoples transplanted into Israel. Feared the Lord, served their own gods after the manner of the nations from among whom they've been carried away. To this day, they do according to the former manner. They do not fear the Lord. They do not follow the statutes or the rules or the law or the commandment that the Lord commanded the children of Jacob, whom he named Israel. You got right there in verse 34. And by the way, there is a paragraph break between 33 and 34. So we're talking about the transplanted people in verse 33. We're talking about the Israelites in verse 34. Right there in verse 34, 3 reasons God destroyed Israel. Right there in one statement. Come down to verse 40, they would not listen. They would not. They chose to not listen. It was their choice. Well, that brings us to Hezekiah in Judah. At this point, Judah stands alone. Hezekiah rules in Judah. And of course, the Assyrians come knocking at the door, and God delivers Judah. Among other things, they lay out their demands, and Hezekiah, receiving from his servants the scroll of the demands, takes the letter in chapter 19, goes to the house of the Lord and unrolls it before the Lord, as if the Lord needs to have it open so he can see it, and prays, you alone of all kingdoms of the earth, you have made heaven and earth. Incline your ear, open your eyes, see and hear the words of Sennacherib that he has sent to mock the living God. Now remember that Sennacherib's representative, the Rabshakeh, alternatively claims, your God has no power to resist us. How many other gods have we steamrolled over their people? And then turns right around and says, your God commanded us to come conquer you. Your God's on our side. Isaiah is Hezekiah's counselor here. You look at chapter 19 and verse 6. Here's the message from Isaiah to Hezekiah. Say to your master, thus says the Lord, do not be afraid because of the words that you've heard, with which the servants of the king of Assyria have reviled me. I will put a spirit in him so that he shall hear a rumor and return to his own land, and I will make him fall by the sword in his own land. You go over to verse 37 in the same chapter. Lo and behold, what happens? Adramelech and Sharezer, his own sons, assassinate him because Esarhaddon, their younger brother, has been elevated over them to be his successor. Well, Esarhaddon manages to claim the throne in spite of their efforts, but Sennacherib is taken out of the way just as God had promised. Now in chapter 20, we see the incident of Hezekiah's illness and his recovery. And the things that stand out here are that, number one, this is in the immediate aftermath of this incident with the Assyrians. God has delivered them, 185,000 Assyrians slain by an angel of the Lord in one night. The Assyrians have retreated. Sennacherib's taken out of the way. And this may be as much nervous prostration on Hezekiah's part as anything. But he's sick. Will I recover? No, you're going to die. Set your house in order. Hezekiah prays, not a boastful prayer, but a prayer of recollection. And God turns Isaiah around. I'll give you 15 more years. Hezekiah is 39 years old at this point and childless. 3 years later, he's going to father Manasseh and leave behind a son who is almost old enough to rule. Manasseh will have the longest reign in all of Judah's history, 55 years. And Manasseh's claim to fame is that for all the good that daddy did, he undoes it all and then some, before God rather abruptly turns him around. Manasseh introduces more evil than all of the other kings and all of the other nations in Israel, in Judah. Manasseh will introduce worship of Moloch and sacrifice his own sons in honor of a non-existent deity. And because of this and his shedding of abundant innocent blood, verse 16 in chapter 21, God will send Manasseh into captivity in Babylon. Now, at this point, Babylon is still the handmaid of the Assyrian Empire. So it's probably the Assyrians actually that overwhelm him, but he's sent to Babylon. And while he's there, he repents, as we read in Chronicles. And God restores him, and he walks, as God says to Isaiah, he walks softly before the Lord. In 2 Chronicles chapter 33, when he comes back, he takes away the foreign gods, verse 15, and the idol from the house of the Lord, threw them outside the city, restored the altar of the Lord, offered sacrifices of peace offerings and thanksgiving, and commanded Judah to serve the Lord. So he turned things around to a large degree. He is succeeded after 55 years on the throne by Ammon. And Ammon reigns 2 years, an unrighteous man who will not humble himself before the Lord. And his own servants assassinated him, took him out. And they made Josiah king in his place. Josiah, the boy king of Judah, as we sometimes describe him. Godly king. Restores the temple. Restores proper worship. Keeps the Sabbath year, or something akin to it. Keeps the Passover. Defiles the altars, as he was prophesied 330 odd years before to do, with the bones of false prophets. Restores the law. The book of the law had been misplaced, concealed. One of the things to remember through all of this, when there is an evil king in Jerusalem, what does it seem the priests do? They generally seem to go along with him. For the most part, it's kind of like, well, we know which side our bread is buttered on, and they accommodate. Now, when we read that Manasseh shed much innocent blood, a lot of that innocent blood may have been priests that tried to stand up to him. That's speculation on my part. But when there's an evil king on the throne, we don't see a lot of copious pushback from the priests. And that does not speak well of them. Josiah in chapter 35 of 2nd Chronicles, they keep Passover for the first time in who knows how long. It may have been akin to a Jubilee, not a Jubilee, but a Sabbath year at this point, but it's not explicitly stated. They are restoring things. Josiah seems to be the one king who, in many respects, goes farther toward restoring things than any other king had done. But God is going to take Josiah out of the picture in battle against Pharaoh, because it's time for Judah to go into captivity. Josiah is killed in battle at age 39. He reigned 31 years. Pharaoh represented the only military power that could even effectively challenge the Assyrians or the Babylonians at this point, Chaldeans, as they're called. And Pharaoh marches his army up out of Egypt through the territory of Judah and what had been Israel to meet in battle with the Assyrian, Babylonian, Chaldean Empire at Carchemish. Up to this point, Egypt has been able to exert a lot of influence in Judah because they're close. Judah's a lot closer to Egypt than it is to Babylon. It's not farther to Babylonian controlled territory, because the Babylonians inherited the Assyrian Empire and the Assyrians owned Israel. So it's just a few miles to Babylonian territory. But to Babylon, to the seat of government, it's a long way. It's hundreds of miles around the Fertile Crescent, almost 1,000 miles. It's not near that far to Egypt. And Egypt has, all through this time, tried to exert influence, tried to control, because they're bigger, they're more powerful, they're more numerous, they're richer. Remember, it was the Egyptians that had looted the temple and the city generations before. in the days of Rehoboam. Because it's time to get Josiah out of the way. Because God had promised Josiah will not live to see the destruction of the nation. Josiah goes out to confront Pharaoh in battle and dies. He's wounded. They take him back to Jerusalem. He dies there. They mourn for him. And immediately they turn around away from God. They took Jehoahaz, Josiah's son, chapter 36 in 2 Chronicles, made him king. 23 years old, reigned 3 months. Didn't really even have time to be a good or a bad king. You know, it's interesting. We don't find him characterized as good or bad before he could even get the throne warm, basically. Pharaoh comes in and deposes him and puts Judah under tribute and replaces him with Eliakim and changes Eliakim's name to Jehoiakim and takes Jehoahaz to Egypt. Think about the impression that that must have made on the people of Judah. Where had they come from in their minds originally? They had come out of Egypt, hadn't they? Now, mind you, they knew their history, that Abraham had come from the Ur of the Chaldees, which is over past Babylon. They know what their history is, but as a people, as a nation, where had they come from? They'd come out of Egypt. And now here is their king being taken back to Egypt as a prisoner. That had to be demoralizing and dispiriting for them. And the king that's on their throne was put there by an Egyptian.
It shouldn't have been a
Former
surprise to
minister.
them.
It shouldn't have been.
Telling them.
It should not have been a surprise. And Jeremiah and Ezekiel had been foretelling these things all along. Well, Ezekiel not yet, but Jeremiah had been. Should not have been a surprise at all. But just think how demoralizing it was. Jehoiakim reigns 11 years. This is about 609 that these events take place. Jehoiakim reigns 11 years and Nebuchadnezzar comes along. I said 609, it's a little before that, about 620. And Nebuchadnezzar comes along and binds him, takes him to Babylon. So things change in a very short time. The dominant power is no longer Egypt, it's Babylon. Why is it no longer Egypt? They lost against the Babylonians at Carchemish. Necho killed Josiah, evidently on his way to Carchemish. And Necho, the Pharaoh, deposed Jehoahaz and replaced him with Jehoiakim 3 months later on his way from Carchemish, licking his wounds, headed back to Egypt. And he imposes tribute and tariff on Judah. But he really doesn't have much power to enforce that, because the Babylonians are the undisputed military masters of the ancient world at this point. And so we go from Jehoiakim to Jehoiachin. Jehoiakim is deposed, died rather, and Jehoiachin replaces him. Jehoiachin is deposed after 3 months and 10 days and replaced by Zedekiah, or Mattaniah, his brother. And this time, it's the Babylonians who do the deposing and anointing, not the Egyptians. Zedekiah is 21 years old, reigns 11 years in Jerusalem. He's the last king ever to sit on the throne of David in Jerusalem. There will be no more kings in Jerusalem ever, ever, evermore of the lineage of David. There will be kings in Jerusalem, Herod and his descendants, but they're not of the family of David. Jesus will never sit on the throne of David in Jerusalem, because Jeremiah foretells that no offspring of Jehoiachin or Jeconiah can prosper on David's throne in Jerusalem, Jeremiah 22. So this is the last king. Jerusalem is captured and burned, 586 BC. These Jews are taken away as captives, where the previous deportations were forced settlers, basically. And then we go 70 years, 70 Sabbaths, verse 21, to fulfill all of its 70 years. And then Cyrus, the king of Persia, lets them come home, 536 BC. That's where we stop. And of course, the final part of the story is Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, the restoration, and those writing prophets that correspond to that period.
BC.
BC.
No,
Yes.
I mean, Cyrus has to come home at 5:30.
536 to return, 586 when Jerusalem is destroyed. If you want a copy of the final, as an audit student, I'll be happy to pass it along. I'll have to email it to you. I don't have any printed copy.
Okay.
I say that. I don't think I have any. No, I don't have any extra printed copies. No, I'll have to email it to you. But if you want one, just let me know. A little over time. Questions, comments, thoughts? Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Lamentations in the fall. Isaiah on Tuesday nights or Monday nights, I guess. Jeremiah and Lamentations on Thursday nights.
You're teaching both?
Randy Key's teaching Isaiah, will be, and I will be teaching Jeremiah and Lamentations.
That was good yesterday. I mean, what was it, 28th, no, 5th, May 5th, about the information you gave us on Lamentation, Isaiah. That was just a little bit, but it was